If you want to understand the future of media, you can try to cobble it together from the news you see in the trades, or you can talk to somebody who really knows, someone who gets it, somebody like Doug Shapiro. Doug is a writer, strategist, advisor, and one of the sharpest minds thinking about the forces reshaping media, technology, and entertainment today. He's worked inside some of the biggest companies in the industry and now helps leaders navigate the disruption, whether it's streaming economics, advertising shifts, or the increasing role of generative AI. But what I love about Doug is that he's asking the deeper questions about how value even gets created in media in the first place and who's really benefiting in the changing landscape. He has this rare ability to kind of zoom out and see the whole system, creators, platforms, investors, and audiences, and then connect the dots in ways that make you rethink the assumptions you've been carrying. In this episode, we get into where the money's flowing, how value is really created, and where the real power is shifting. We also talk about what it all means for the future of entertainment, media, and the modern creative ecosystem. So anyway, please stick around. I think you're going to really find this one fascinating. Doug Shapiro, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you. I've seen you talk multiple times. Each time I need new cartridges for my pen because I take furious notes. But thank you so much for being on with us.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And I'm amazed you used a pen. I have one of those around here someplace too.
You're the author of The Mediator, and as well as being a thought leader and I've seen you speak at so many conferences so well about the state of media and the major shifts we're going through, and actually really well articulating how we're actually going through two different shifts that are happening at the same time and causing a bit of a perfect storm.
So I've been in and around media for my whole career, so for more than 30 years. And I was an analyst on Wall Street for about 15 years. And then I worked at Time Warner for 12 years. And then, since then I've been writing and advising. I've basically had the same core job, which is to recognize the big shifts as they're happening, to figure out how those pieces all fit together, to predict what they mean for the future, and then to create some, to figure out what to do about it. Pattern recognition, synthesis, forecast, call to action. That's always what I've done. It's always what I've enjoyed doing. So, for instance, as an analyst, I don't know how much you know about the job of Wall Street analyst, but there's a lot of ways you can be good at it. You could be a great stock picker. You could be great at having industry contacts and connecting investors to senior executives, what's called corporate access. You could have great financial models. What I always really enjoyed the most was just figuring out the big moving pieces and understanding what they implied about where the world was going. It's just like what I've always really enjoyed doing. That's what I'm still doing today.
Yeah, the only thing I know about analysts is what I've learned from either Margin Call or The Big Short.
Those are always completely accurate because, whatever you see on TV or Hollywood, it's 100% true to life.
Well, I figured. And you look remarkably like Ryan Gosling.
Yeah, no, I get that a lot. Yeah.
Just to kind of lay the foundation for people who only have a surface level understanding, I think it's no news to anybody who cares about media and creativity that major shifts are happening with networks. Major shifts are happening with traditional media companies and conglomerates. Obviously MGM closing down, now owned by Amazon. Paramount now being taken over by an Oracle proxy, if you will, in Skydance Media. I think a lot of people are blaming it on streaming and Netflix. And I think that that's really a surface level understanding of what's happening. Can you give a slightly broader understanding of what really the shift that we're seeing is?
Usually the one sentence summary that I give or that I use is that the last 10 to 15 years in the media business were really defined by the disruption of content distribution. And I also talk, and I'm sure we will get to this, but I think there's another disruption coming. But you're not asking about that. You're asking about how do we get to where? Yeah, not yet. How do we get to where we are today? If you go back to like the 80s, you had these two foundational technological changes or shifts. One was digitization, and the other one was the internet. And prior to that, media was completely siloed, right? You had a different way of creating and distributing and consuming the news versus television versus film versus radio. And then what happened was the digitization and internet they came in, they unified all of those media in bits. They basically made the atomic unit of all media the bit, and they unified them all on one network, which is the internet. And what that did was it fundamentally changed the architecture of media. And the biggest thing it did, the biggest consequence of that was it caused the cost to distribute media to go from really expensive to basically it put it on a path to be essentially free, right? And that really brought down the barriers to entry. And so to distribute media, and you had, new competitors rush in every form of media. And so when I talk about the disruption of content distribution, that's what I mean, is that this technological shift, barriers to entry come down, new competitors come in, and they change the economics of the media business. And so you could tie that directly to what I call the 5 tectonic themes that dominate the media business today. One is price deflation, that there's just pricing pressure because of this new supply, basically. The stagnation of the revenue pie, which is that, that media revenue is ultimately constrained by the amount of time people spend, and there's only so much time in the day, and I have this stat I show a lot that US adults are spending 75% of their waking time with media today. And so there's just not a lot of attention. There's not a lot of time to go around. The third one is the fragmentation of attention. Obviously, your attention's getting split up in all these different directions. And part of that is because there's so much supply. But another part, which maybe we'll talk about, is that the consumer definition of quality is changing. People are embracing some of these new forms of media, and they care more about things like authenticity and relatability and my parasocial relationship with the creator or whatever. So the definition of quality is changing. The
And
fourth one.
I think quickly on that, I think that is a similar thing that happened, when Sundance in the 90s, when people started making movies on camcorders and things like that, it was a similar kind of thing. People were like, wait, if there's a really good story here and a good storyteller behind it, I almost don't matter that's a little bit grainy and a little bit shot on VHS and whatever else. I actually, and those movies started to do well. It's sort of, that's always been in there for good storytellers.
Yeah, and I think that right now, I mean, we can talk about it because I think it's a very interesting topic. And it's one that if you're in these businesses and you grew up with a certain definition of quality, especially one that really revolved around, super high production values and high budgets, it just could be like a really hard thing to swallow. But it seems very clear. And you can see right now in media what's growing mostly in television, it's YouTube. In gaming, it's Roblox, which is little blocky characters, right? In music, even, it's like functional music, ambient music. The stuff that's high production value is pretty stagnant. Where the growth is stuff that you would consider not high production value, but it has these other attributes of quality, like it is more raw, more authentic, more relatable. Anyway, we'll get back to that. So the fourth on this idea of what I call disintermediation. The middlemen, the traditional power brokers in media, are losing bargaining power. And we could talk about that. And then the last one is what I call concentration, that because everything's on a network, now everything is networked. Networks have very strong positive feedback loops, which make strong things stronger. And so you end up with these network effects, super powerful platforms. You end up with like a few hits, but this very long tail of anonymity. The bottom line is that you had these, foundational technological changes, and you can draw pretty much a straight line from there to where we are now. And so when you think about, when I think about like the, challenges in Hollywood and, why is production not snapped back after the strikes, and why is there cord cutting, and why is RSN's failing, and why is Paramount being sold, and why is WBD splitting up, and why is NBCU splitting up, and why are there all these questions about why did Bob Iger come back, and why did Scarlett Johansson sue Disney over the way Black Widow was distributed? All of these things are basically happening because there's just less money in the system. And you can trace that all back to that disruption, is that new entrants come in, and this is like econ 101. When there's more supply, when there's more competitors, profits go down. And so that's kind of where we are now, is we're just in a media business where a lot of value has shifted to consumers in the form of more choices and generally at lower costs. You think about TV as an example, what people used to pay for cable compared to what you pay today for streaming. There's this sort of meme that you're paying the same, because but it's not. It's not true. The truth is that people are legitimately, they have 4 services on average. Maybe they're spending, maybe they're spending $40 on average, $50 on average. They're not spending 110, 120, what they used to spend. So that's kind of, anyway, that's the brief sketch of why are we where we are now.
Yeah, and I think there was a metric you said at some point, which was that the actual all of the growth in the media sector is being entirely accounted for by the creator economy. Now, and traditional media is actually shrinking or staying entirely stagnant. Is that right?
Yeah, not entirely. I mean, not entirely. I mean,
Mhm.
by my math, the creator economy is about 15% of all media revenue. Even though it's small, because it's growing so fast, it's represented about half of the growth of all media pie. So the rest is growing very slowly, slower than
Mhm.
the rest is growing slower than inflation. So you'd say it's actually shrinking on a real basis, on an absolute basis. So it depends on how you want to define growth. Either way, it's not. It's pretty stagnant.
And either way, I mean the outlook just isn't great for traditional media.
Yeah. Is that a statement or a question?
That was a sort of statement generally.
Yeah. So then I'm going to allow you to make statements without commenting on them.
I think that what was interesting about something that you talked about in one of your talks was this shift that all of that democratization of the distribution platform, A, it's making people expect things to be cheaper, but B, it's changing the nature of the creatives in the media sector. That you used to have creatives, and what they required in order to do their work was they required a media company or a publishing house or any number of creative companies or media companies to provide them with access to high level production infrastructure so that their creative ideas could then be distributed by that media company. And now what we're seeing is creators who have as many of the tools now as they possibly can. I mean, I always think that when I was in film school, the notion of getting your hands on a lighting kit was an exciting prospect. If the lighting kit wasn't booked and you could get your hands on it in film school, that was a big weekend. Now there are lighting kits all around America in people's homes and living rooms. So that was a really interesting perspective for me, that the shift between creatives to creators, and that we're seeing a real emboldening of the creator ecosystem.
Yeah, and I went through that list of those tectonic trends really quickly, but one of them is disintermediation, which is what I mean, what you're describing by that, in the sense that technology has democratized really every step of the product development process to certain degrees. So where my whole, like, you can trace this back to the disruption of distribution theory gets a little bit blurry is distribution was the big one. Like, the fall of the distribution moat was the big one because the costs really went to zero. I mean, you're going to distribute this podcast for what's essentially free. I put out a Substack for free. Today I didn't have to have a printing press and trucks and delivery people, right? But the other parts have also been democratized to a certain degree. Like production, depending on what medium you're talking about, production is cheaper. You have cheaper in-home hardware, which is just, better chips and, more global competition and all that. You have in-home editing software, like you said. You have Billie Eilish and her brother can create a multi-platinum album in their house, right? Which is what they did. Marketing is now being democratized to some degree by social. Monetization is being democratized by these kind of self-service distribution platforms, whether it's Spotify or Sub or YouTube or whatever. So yeah, every step, to varying degrees, has been democratized by technology, and so that has given rise to this creator class. And you're drawing the distinction between a creative that works with the middleman and the creator that has a direct consumer relationship, which I think that's a good way of thinking about it, is that distinction between creative and creator. But it's not only has it created the rise of the whole creator economy that, $250 billion a year and growing rapidly, but even for creatives, it's changing in a more subtle way, or a subtler way. It's changing their relationship with the middleman. It's giving them more bargaining power over the middleman, because they can circumvent them, and you see things, when you see Taylor Swift say, I'm going to film the Eras Tour movie and then distribute it without a studio, right? Or when you see what's happening in music, which is every new artist, almost all new artists these days emerge from the tail of self-distribution on Bandcamp, SoundCloud, or TikTok, or YouTube, or whatever. And the first thing they do when they have a couple of hits is they go cut a major label deal, right? They want the validation, they want the infrastructure, but they're walking in the door with more bargaining power than they had a decade ago, right? And they're asking for things like, I want a rights reversion. I want rights to my masters back. I am effectively renting you. I'm licensing you the rights to my music. I'm not giving them to you. I'm not selling them to you. So yeah, that disintermediation, that sort of weakening of the middle is also it is definitely happening, and happening in very obvious, explicit ways when you look at the rise of creators that have done away with the middlemen altogether, and in these subtler ways, as you see bargaining power shifting to the creatives that are at the very top, tippy top of the head of the curve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because there's usually been this path that a creator travels up and does really well, and then they sort of tend to go into traditional media. Joe Rogan, for example, has his podcast, and then he goes into and does a huge deal with Spotify, or Howard Stern with XM. But now we're kind of seeing that stop a little bit. Like Stephen Bartlett just recently was offered 100 million by multiple, podcast companies or streaming companies for Diary of a CEO, and he just said a flat out no. He was like, I don't think there's much worth in me doing a deal with you. I can grow better on my own, have more freedom, and my 100 million isn't all just a cash check of 100 million. It's tied to certain, targets I have to hit, but targets I have to hit on a media platform I don't own. So if I can keep control of my media and my distribution channel, I know what my growth looks like, and I know that I can kind of get there on my own. And even somebody like Mr. Beast as well. I mean, he's doing Beast games with a traditional distributor, but he's taking his money and going. I mean, they're not gaining a piece of anything else that he's creating.
Yeah, and I guess the only place I push back is I don't really think of Spotify as traditional media, but yeah, I think the relationship with I don't want to say anything I don't want to denigrate anyone, but I think the music labels are an interesting model for this because their relationship, their value proposition to artists changed a lot over the course of a decade. It used to be that they needed a label to do to finance the production and to do the distribution. Like if you wanted to be in Tower Records, right? If you wanted radio play, if you wanted any of that stuff, like you had to be with a label. Like there just wasn't viable to be an independent musician and have any kind of real presence. But they completely pivoted. They changed what their value proposition was to the artist. They are basically brand management machines, and they have access to global data. And so they bring analytics chops and say, oh, you're blowing up in, Hokkaido. It's time to do a Japan tour, whatever it is. Like, but they've really changed what their value proposition is. And in a lot of ways that, I think might be what the future of those companies, all of these traditional middlemen is like they're all going to have to reassert what is their value proposition to the artist, in which case it's not about owning anymore. It's about, it's basically effectively an agency relationship. Maybe there's some equity ownership of it, but they're really a service provider to the creator, if not an own. It used to be they extended all the capital, took all the risk, owned all the upside, owned the IP, and there's a future over some period of time where that's not what the media, the traditional media business is going to be anymore. It's going to be, we are a service provider to the creator, creative, whatever you want to call them, and they're going to do stuff with us, and they're going to do stuff off platform. And we're going to just try to provide as much value as we can so we can ride along with that. So it's definitely like there's definitely it's one of these things where, there's that there's that power of David Foster Wallace gave this commencement speech at Kenyon College. I don't know if you ever read this. It's worth reading, although it's hard. It's a little harder to read in hindsight, because it reads differently. But the beginning of it tells us, story about these two young fish who are swimming along, and they encounter the big fish, and the big fish is like, "Hey guys, how's the water today?" And they keep swimming, and then one of the little fish turns to the other fish and goes, "Water? What's water?" And I think you can be so in the thick of this stuff that you don't really see. It's hard to see what's going on around you, but this is what's happening. There's this like fundamental shift of what is the role of the middleman in the value chain.
Yeah. It's funny because that's also, it occurs to me that, so much of sort of SaaS and technology tools are service based already. So it sort of, it sort of dovetails a little bit that thought into, what your one of your pillars about concentration, and that actually the biggest media companies are not media companies. They're big technical companies or tech companies. Google, Meta, Amazon, Apple, these are the ones sort of, now cannibalizing kind of the entire media space, and they're acting as a service. So it sort of makes sense that the media infrastructure shift is also moving towards a service shift rather than an IP ownership and production shift.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very insightful way of thinking about it, is that they're effectively, yeah, they you're right. They deal on mass scale. They don't have the resources. It's not practical to be white glove, high touch service. Like, they just provide a open platform. Here it is. Here's tools, and we're agnostic to who succeeds and who fails, and we're not going to own the equity. Sometimes they give a nice split like YouTube does, and sometimes they give basically no split like Meta does. But yeah, I think that's like I said, a pretty incisive way, is that they're kind of setting the terms of this new media landscape, and they are service providers.
Yeah. And YouTube, I mean, giving a split is working out very well for them. I think one of the statistics you mentioned previously, or when I've seen you speak, is that new YouTube hours are outstripping Hollywood by 20,000 times annually.
Yeah, that's right. And they actually haven't updated this number in a long time, but they used to say that, I think it was maybe 2019, it was at the YouTube Newfront presentation or something. They said that there's 500 hours of video uploaded every minute. So it ends up being about, you get, and I gotta think it's higher since then, but it's around 300 million hours a year. And by my math, Hollywood puts out about 15,000 hours a year, at least in the US, of TV and film. So that is 20,000 times as much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, it definitely, working for them. I think that, one of the things that I found very interesting was you broke down very well the media disruption kind of playbook, and you sub-segmented it to be like, okay, like, there's deep library, there's kids things, there's reality TV shows, and you sort of graded each type of media, with and related it to its ability or how difficult it was to make, and that YouTube seems to really be servicing that. And Netflix obviously did it very well, but Netflix started with deep library of lots of different media companies existing IP, but then kind of grew in their confidence level up the sort of disruption chain. Could you talk to a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what you're referring to is my efforts to overlay the disruption of TV onto Clay Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation, which is not media specific. It's really plays out all over the place. Like, you think about, Airbnb as an example. So the idea is that the disruptor comes in, you have an incumbent industry. A lot of times they're over-serving their customers. There's some subset of their customers who you're just charging too much, you're giving them more than they need. And so the upstart comes in. Usually there's some technology that catalyzes this, that enables the new upstart to come in. They come into the market with something that's cheap and crappy. And the incumbent's like, ha, 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 that's nothing. They completely ignore it and smoke some cigars and take a car service or have a whiskey or whatever they do, right? but that product appeals to some subset of the market, the subset that was overserved. They're like, great, I want it's good and quote unquote good enough for me, and it gets a foothold. And then the insurgent, so they're first targeting the least demanding customers, and then they move up to the next least demanding customers, and they keep moving up the curve, which is what you're referring to. And so in the case of Netflix, when they came out, like the least demanding customers, like deep, there was a cheap product, right? People were paying whatever 80 at that time, 80 to $90 a month for cable. This thing was $7.99. And then like actually at the beginning it was free, right? They used to give away the streaming service free to subscribers who got their DVD by mail service. And like, we're just going to give you a bunch of like old movies and old TV shows. And then eventually they, started to do some kids, and they started to, they got to higher quality, syndicated stuff, right? Like they did the big stars deal, and all of a sudden they had Disney and Sony movies in the pay one window. So you had Ratatouille, you had Bad Boys, and whatever it was, right? And then they kept moving up, then they got kids, and they started doing originals, and then higher quality originals, and then theatricals, and now they're at the very top of the curve. So, you could do that with Airbnb, right? Like when it first came out, it was you paid to sleep on someone's couch, and then, the quality of their inventory just kept getting better and better and better. And now you can rent a multi-million-dollar villa, and, there's this thing Airbnb Luxe where you can get concierge services and private chefs and whatever you want. So it's just this is a recurring thing is, you think about like digital photography, and when it first came out, like it was, very low fidelity, whatever it was, pixelated. Again, same kind of idea is it just starts low and gets better and better and better. Yeah, that's what Netflix has clearly done. Like that process has run its course. In the case of, and they really just, if you think about it this way, they disrupted the TV business from the inside, in the sense that they're making the same kind of content with the same talent, but for the same money, or more money, right? But now YouTube is really disrupting TV from the outside, because they're doing it in a different way, and they've picked off kids. The kids business really gotten crushed by you. The traditional kids business has gotten crushed by YouTube. A lot of the most popular kids shows in the world are on, Kokomo or whatever is on YouTube. Maybe it's distribution on Netflix also. It's primarily YouTube. And, then if you say, okay, who's next least demanding? You say, well, unscripted, it's those viewers. And you'd say, well, the most popular unscripted show in the world is Mr. Beast. I mean, Perfect is unscripted, and you get like cooking shows, and now you're starting to see some kind of like sketch comedy, not a lot of like long form narrative stuff yet, but you're starting to see some of that. And so it's moving up the curve. And again, we haven't talked about Gen AI yet, but my thesis is that those tools, Vios and Soras and Lumas and all of those things, Stable Diffusion, the open source ones, are going to throw kind of gas on that fire, that they're going to further close the production value gap between what is possible by a creator and what's possible from a corporate media or quote unquote professionally produced media. And that's going to what enables creator content to continue moving up that performance curve.
And I think, yeah, because it was exactly where I was going to head next, is that, creator content had stagnated up that curve, and there was no real sense that they were going to push past, their limitations in reality or unscripted programming. And that the only ones who would be the Mr. Beasts or the Paul brothers, or people who had reached a level of success that they could invest in significant media, but there was no real threat that they would get into scripted or, long form narrative storytelling. I mean, it just didn't.
Or a theatrical movie, like a 2 hour, exactly, action adventure, no.
Precisely. And now, with Gen AI, suddenly it becomes the possibility of anyone in their dorm room, in their, living room at home, to be able to experiment with storytelling. And all we really know about storytelling or script writing or any of those things is the more you do it, the better you get at it. And these creators are incredibly committed. And these tools, put out by these tech companies are incredibly cheap. And so now you're going to have, and sure, once again, I'm sure they'll put out stuff and everybody go, well, it's pretty crappy and the story doesn't work and this isn't quite great. but give it 5 years and that creator will have experienced, producing 5 films in the time that a traditional director might have only produced one or two.
Yeah, and also there's just the law of large numbers, just the sheer volume of these people, because there's this, whatever, I don't even know what you'd call it, but there's people talk about, if an infinite number of monkeys had an infinite number of typewriters, that they would eventually, one of them would write the great American novel, right? It's the sort of the same thing here, is that when you think about this disruption that was of TV that was largely driven by Netflix. Netflix was one company with a lot of money, and then you'd say Amazon came in, and maybe Hulu. So maybe there were three companies that were driving the disruption. Now you're talking, there's 130 million channels on YouTube, right? There may be tens of millions of people, and people who, I mean, if you think about Hollywood and how many people actually have green light authority in town, I mean, I don't know what it is. Is it a dozen? Is it eight? Is it, there's only a few people who, when you think about it, who really control the allocation of capital. And now you're going to have, who knows how many millions of people of would be creators out there. Very, very few, a very, very tiny percentage of those need to succeed to completely change the supply demand dynamic.
It's the infinite monkeys and infinite typewriters is an interesting one. Because also it calls to mind the way AI works, doing lots of different tasks all at the same time to come up with one answer. But also you're writing a book now called Infinite Content, and the parallels there are quite interesting to me, because you're right. It's also going to cause, right now there's this idea of getting on the Greyhound bus and going to LA with a dream, and that's where that is required to happen. But it's only going to take somebody in a dorm room at SMU to do something really great that goes viral online, that someone in Hollywood goes, hey, you should come out here and have a chat about this new franchise we're doing, or some, TV show we're making. And everyone else in the dorm rooms will go nuts and start
But
trying
like,
it.
or Bangalore or Ghana, or, I mean, think about like, someplace in Indonesia, like, um, there's all these markets that they completely import markets for content, that where who knows what you could. There's this concept of the lost Einstein, of how many geniuses lived and died and never had access to the resources to discover to discover the theory of relativity, or whatever it was they might have done, that are now theoretically going to have access to these tools. So yeah, like completely. And it's also interesting to contrast that against the, what I would say, rising degree of risk aversion in Hollywood, because as things are getting tougher, development executives are even more inclined to go with the safe bet, and so you end up with more sameness. Whereas in this nearly infinite sea of creators, you're going to see all kinds of like super super interesting stuff, because why not? Different formats, different kinds of stories. And then you get to another thing, which I don't know if you were heading down this path at some point too, and so I will float it and then we can reel it back. But the idea that generative AI is not only going to be a cheaper way to make movies and TV shows, but it also has unique attributes that's going to enable unique kinds of content. And so I'll pause there to see. I don't want to jump ahead of your.
No, that's fantastic. Because I mean, yeah, no, let's get into that, because you had a great word. It was a long one that started with an S. I've read it multiple times. I still can't remember to pronounce it.
Yeah. So it's the word is skeuomorphic, and it's something that this VC at A16Z, a guy named Chris Dixon, talks about a lot, is skeuomorphism, because I think it's originally a design term. So like when you look at your, maybe this will help you remember, maybe you won't, but when you look at your phone, and the clock icon is an analog clock, right? That's called skeuomorphic design. Obviously analog about that app that's telling you the time, right? There's there's no gears, there's nothing in there, like there's no hands. So applied to media, what it means is that the first applications of a new medium tend to be an imitation of the prior medium. And so when you think about film, the first films were just recorded stage plays, right? And then over time, or think about magazines, and the first magazines you read online were like static PDFs, and you like pressed a button and the page flipped or whatever. And then what happens is eventually the creatives will figure out what are the unique attributes of this medium. So you think about film, and there's the whole vocabulary of film and different kinds of shots, special effects, and all that stuff. Or in magazines now, you have infinite scroll and hypertext links and embedded video and all kinds of other things. You have blogs and microblogging and all kinds of different formats and stuff. So it raises the question: what are the new applications that are going to be possible with generative AI? And we don't really know. I mean, it's going to happen in weird ways. Like I always say that the fact that ASMR is a thing, that there's a YouTuber with 35 million subscribers who like does mukbang or whatever, eats food or eats cookies, and I'm like, I'm like, that's a thing. Why is that a thing? It's happening. I think we have to be prepared. I'm sure we are, but for it to happen in unexpected ways. But you think about things like, okay, it's super super cheap, right? So we talked about cheap, but cheap doesn't only mean like make a movie cheaper. It could mean that we're doing things like A/B testing of creative, right? Like you're putting out versions because it's cheap. Or you think about fan creation, that creation will be democratized. For people are going to want to interact with their favorite IP by remixing it and doing their like their fanfic and whatever it is. We could look out. I saw this stat, which I'll probably mangle, but I think it's something like Kodak said in the year 2000 there were 80 billion photos taken, and then last year there were 2 trillion photos taken. And it's because everyone has a camera, right? So you could have a world in 5 years where the encroaching competition on time spent with media or time spent consuming media is time spent creating media. You could have people spending hours making stuff, right? Sort of like the Minecraftification of linear. I'm going to make stuff, and I'm going to really enjoy the making and watching. And then when it's cool, then I'll share it with my friends, and maybe it blows up, and maybe a lot of people watch it on YouTube when I post it. So you end up like with this one media property that ends up serving anything on a long continuum, from a personalized experience to a niche experience to a submass to maybe it becomes part of the canon and part of the Minecraft, the Minecraft movie, right? Or who knows what. So you could have this whole range of experiences all birthed out of one IP, like there's an interesting idea. Other things, you could think about like, okay, it's rendered real time, right? What does that mean if it's not locked and just, today you make TV show, it's locked and you distribute it. Like, what does it mean if it can actually be rendered in real time? So you could have interactive stories or personalized stories or emergent stories. You have this company Fable, the simulation. I don't know if you're familiar with them, Edward Saatchi, but his thesis is that humans will create story worlds where the human will kind of define the mythology and the character development and all that. But then the stories actually emerge out of a simulation. Like you let these characters live a simulated life, and then the way you create content is by subjecting them to certain circumstances. I think that's kind of the idea. But that idea of like an emergent story, right? Like you think about like a Song of Fire and Ice. You think about George R. R. Martin creating this incredibly rich mythology. And what if the stories could emerge out of that without human direction, right? Crazy stuff. What does it mean that like all video is inherently three-dimensional and that everybody is the cinematographer? You can watch anything from any angle you want. So anyway, I'm just saying like there's my guess is that the killer app for generative AI video may not even be just a cheaper $1 million movie that looks like $100 million movie. It may be an entirely new form. Yeah, it's just going to be another competitor for time and attention.
Right. I think that that's what's so great about the title of your book. It evokes in the mind exactly what you just described. This notion of, you know, owning your own storytelling world and allowing people to come in to experience it. It's driven by AI. All of the media and the production of it is driven by AI. And you are just kind of the plate spinner topping up the plates and going, well, I don't like the way this character's development is going, or I think Sansa Stark should go over and do that actually.
She should end up with a middle finger.
If you're particularly awful to her,
Yeah.
I guess a pat on your back for such a great title of that book. But I think it does. I think it evokes that potential future where that's what we're all doing. And you're right. There's a joy in that creation that might be the entertainment itself. That's a really
Yeah.
interesting point.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not to go too far with this, but I think when you think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? This idea of like you need the base is you need shelter and food and security and whatever. And then like there's this tippy top of the pyramid of self-actualization. But you see people creating content in, prisons and concentration camps and war and all that. Like, that you could argue that the creation is actually much closer to the bottom of it's actually not a self-actualization thing that you do when you retire and you're like, now I'm going to paint. It's actually this very fundamental human need. And so, yeah, that argues for, I think pretty much every time tools have made creation more accessible, the volume of creation goes up a lot. I got another one that just to think about this. So like, TikTok is well, I'm just saying on this point, YouTube is a consumption app, right? It's geared around consumption. TikTok is a creation app, with filters and the camera embedded in the app, all that sort of stuff. I think something like TikTok does 83% of people who use TikTok have uploaded a video. And for YouTube, there's, 113 million channels, but there's like, I don't know, whatever, it's 2.5 billion MAUs. It's sort of like, it's like, whatever single digit percentages. And so that difference is because, one is geared around creation and one is not. And when you geared around creation, people create. So yeah, I think it's a bigger deal. It's fun to think about some of these, much broader implications of what we're talking about. And just this idea like, oh, here's a way to make that, Spider-Man for 50 million instead of 100 million, like, or whatever. Like it's a very linear way of thinking. And like those linear things are going to have to happen first before some of these other things come to pass. If you went back to the release of the iPhone in 2007 and said, okay, so here's this thing, so it's like, oh, cool, they have an iPod that you can make calls on. And you're like, well, yeah, except because of that iPod you can make calls on, within a decade, you will be choosing sexual partners on that thing. You will press a button and then get into a stranger's car to go meet them. And then you're going to get to a restaurant and you're going to take pictures of your food and, and distribute it to everyone and don't know in the world. What are you talking about? Like, meaning like just this stuff takes a long time to play out, but like it's going to have I think some really profound impacts on us.
Yeah. I mean, is there a way, do you think, for legacy media? I mean, do you see a silver bullet or silver bullet strategy? Is there a way for legacy media to compete or fight back?
It gets to something I'm writing that I haven't published yet, where I think I think one thing is really embracing this idea of being a service provider, of reasserting the role they have in the value chain, bringing their professional skill sets to bear. But another thing, which I'm reluctant to kind of spool out, but I could try, I guess, is this something I said at a conference a couple of weeks ago, this idea that in an AI world, trust is the new oil. And what I mean by that is that in the attention economy, data was considered the new oil. You needed to basically trying to monetize people's attention. Data is helpful because you can now know more about those people and what they're doing. But the attention economy is really taking on water, right? Like it's having all kinds of negative societal impacts, whether it's disinformation and, all this political polarization and social networks that try to keep us hooked on these like dopamine loops and, kids, whatever the whole like the anxious generation, the Jonathan Haidt thing about, the negative implications of phones and all that stuff. It's like it's clearly not good that the world that it has wrought is not good. I think AI is going to devalue attention. There's going to be so much noise in the system that the value of attention is going to diminish. And also, I think a lot of consumers are going to turn to the use of agents for some things. And as soon as you put a mediator between you and and the content, like the value of that ad goes to zero, right? The bot is not going to be like, whoa, that looks cool. If you're shifting from this, the attention economy, the whole foundation of the web, which is advertising, starts to take on water. What emerges in the wake of that is an intention economy, like that you're only going to make money by persuading people to do stuff, to take actual action. And the only way they're going to do that is if they trust the source. And that's why I say trust is the new oil. In an AI world, you need to trust who you're getting stuff from, who's curating things for you. And that's a very different world, right? Like a world where you're trying to maximize attention. We know what that looks like. A world where everyone's trying to maximize trust is a very different thing. Like, how do you earn trust consistently? And so I think that in that world, the traditional media companies that have trusted brands and well-known brands, they actually do have an advantage. So I think that that's another kind of silver lining for traditional media is how we really lean into the trusted relationships that we have with consumers. And could you see sort of a swing back to some degree from the creator economy and these, again, this world where it's all about being as noisy as you can, and we're going to move to a world where it's more important to be trusted.
Right.
So it's a bit of an esoteric, it's a bit of a vague, you can't put that in a spreadsheet and it's worth X, but like I think directionally that is an opportunity for the traditional media companies.
Right. Well, that's amazing. Can I just ask you one question? It's a question we've been asking everybody, which is I had a boss once called Dan Wyden, who giant in the ad world. You wrote Just Do It. And he had a quote where he said, "You're useless to me until you fail big at least twice." Can you remember, and would you be willing to admit a time where you failed and what you learned from it, whether big or small?
No, I mean, I've failed plenty of times. I think, yeah, I guess I should have been ready for this question, but one area, so when I first started writing a couple years ago, I probably got a little bit too enthusiastic about crypto, and not the money part of it, but the tech part of it, the utility part of it, and this idea of a decentralized web, and so I probably leaned into that too much. When I was an analyst, I had plenty of bad stock calls. Probably the most painful one, the biggest failure was I was bullish on a cable company called Adelphia. And it turned out that they were defrauding investors. They had two sets of books. They had like a real set, and then they had the set of books that they used for their financial reporting purposes. And company
So you were right based on the available information.
Exactly. Yeah. I used to, I mean, yes, I think I might have been, the assets ended up having value after the bankruptcy process. Anyway, it was really, I always said it was not my job because I was only being, spoon fed the publicly known information. I wasn't like a forensic accountant who was going in to make sure that they were telling the truth, but that was still a pretty painful thing because there were a lot of people who didn't hold the family that owned the company in high regard. I didn't heed that. So anyway, that was like court depositions, and that wasn't super fun.
What was the main thing you learned from that, you think?
I think the main thing I learned is you have to trust your judgment about people's character. It's easier to say in hindsight than it was in foresight, but that would be the main thing.
Right. Well, Doug, thank you so much for spending so much time with us and for talking everything through. Every time I've seen you at a conference, I'm like, well, that's one I've got to listen to. And I find everything you say so fascinating, and really looking forward to your book. Do you know when you think you might be finishing it, or were you desperately hoping I wouldn't ask that question?
No. I said I'm putting it out, as a public commitment to force myself to do it.
Right.
But I'm aiming to do 2 chapters a month. I have one more chapter I'm going to put out next week, and if I do that, I'll be done by the end of the year. It'll be finished.
Well, infinite content. I will be ordering it the moment it's out.
I'm going to write infinite chapters.
Thanks so much.
Sure, Orlando. Yeah, it was fun. It was a good conversation.
Thank you.
Cool. All right.